Settlers, beware! The Indians are restless. They are idle no more. What is this Idle No More campaign about anyway? Is it about Bill C-45? Or Chief Spence from Attawapiskat, whose hunger strike is trying to get her a meeting with Prime Minister Harper? I suggest that it's about much more than recent events. First Nations people are expressing legitimate anger for over 100 years of injustice, and it's time we listened. I'm a settler too, an immigrant to this land, second-generation German. In my upbringing and education, never once was it mentioned how we came to be on this land. The Canadiana version talked about the vast, empty wilderness that settlers tamed. That's a lie. All of what we now know as Canada was occupied by First Nations people. Our right to settle here is based on treaty. This was not a conquest treaty, but a sharing treaty. So we sit comfortably in this heated room built with the resources of this land. We enjoy a quality of life on this land because we agreed to share. We turn on the tap and get water we can drink. Yet on many First Nations, their tap water is subject to a boil order. There's something uneven about this sharing. I believe the problems are rooted in the philosophies underpinning Canadian policy. I'm going to tell you about some of that ugliness, but not without also letting you know that the solution lies in developing a new relationship based on new understandings. In the U.S., Colonel Sheridan said that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. In Canada, the philosophy was that the only good Indian isn't an Indian at all. That's assimilation legislation in a nutshell. The idea is to get the Indian out of them and add them to the Canadian melting pot. Oh, no, mosaic. They're still allowed to have their food and dance. Residential schools were a tool of the assimilation policy. The legacy of human suffering they have left behind prompted the government's apology in 2008. They didn't work to assimilate Indians because there is still a recognizable, self-identified group called First Nations peoples, even after 100 years or over 100 years of assimilation policy. We apologized for residential schools, but not for the underlying assimilation policy upon which they were based, and we're far from repenting and making things right. Did you know that when the buffalo were gone on the prairies and treaties were signed, First Nations people were interested in learning farming? However, the government philosophies saw them as primitive and less evolved. They felt they needed to pass through that peasant stage of farming technology that had been over in Europe for years before they could use modern techniques. Despite that, they did produce a surplus, which the government then prevented them from selling on the open market. Why? Because it was produced collectively and would be unjust competition for settler farmers. Indians were also not allowed to leave their reserves without special permission, so they couldn't participate in the economy in other ways. Indian women who raised chickens for eggs were unable to leave the reserve to sell them in towns, as other settler farm women did, to supplement their family income. When reserves were on prime agricultural land, like the Calahoo Reserve just northwest of Edmonton, the reserve was eliminated so that the land could be sold to settlers. Bill C-45 is partly about federal control of land without due consultation, which continues these trends. This is the root of the economic disparity. a philosophy of seeing First Nations people as less than. Many settlers came to Canada on the run from religious and political persecution elsewhere. But these persecutions were alive and well in Canada against First Nations people. Their religious ceremonies, like the Sundance and Potlatch, were banned by the Indian Act. We all know the story of how Sitting Bull crossed the medicine line to avoid persecution in the U.S. But do you know how many First Nations people from Canada crossed the 49th parallel, going south to escape Canadian policies? Ask anyone from the Rocky Boy Reserve in Montana, and they can likely trace their ancestries to those leaving Canadian soil. That's a story we don't like to tell. When they had grievances, they were not allowed to organize or hire lawyers to represent them. Another legacy of the Canadian policy that didn't think they were capable. They weren't even given the vote until 1960. But you say to me, this is all in the past. They need to get over it. Did you know that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms only began applying on reserves in June 2012? That means that last year on reserves there was no freedom of religion or peaceful assembly. Those stories of the banning of religious ceremonies and political organizing were not fully reversed until less than a year ago. Bill C-45 passed this fall. It continues to disrespect treaties. These are current issues. The legacy of Canadian Indian policy is abysmal because it is based on faulty premises. It is time for change. We need to learn our history. We need to listen to First Nations people, visit their websites, talk to their leaders, build relationships. We need to find out about the spirit of the treaties. Maybe a few lessons in sharing would benefit us. John F. Kennedy said, "The great enemy of truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic." We need to stop telling ourselves untrue stories about First Nations people. We need to create the political will for positive change in the settler-First Nations relationship. We need to be idle no more. My name is Monica Kreiner. They call me Muniasco.